the third book of Moses, called Leviticus. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if any of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering from the cattle, either from the herd or the flock. If your offering is a burnt sacrifice from the herd, it should be a male without blemish. You shall offer it willingly at the entrance of the tabernacle before the Lord. You shall lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, will bring the blood and sprinkle it around the altar at the entrance of the tabernacle. Then you shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priests, shall put fire on the altar and arrange the wood on the fire. They shall also arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. The internal organs and the legs shall be washed with water, and the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. If your offering is from the flocks, either sheep or goats, for a burnt sacrifice, it shall be a male without blemish. You shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle its blood around the altar. You shall cut it into pieces, including its head and fat, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. The internal organs and the legs shall be washed with water, and the priest shall bring all of it and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. If your offering to the Lord is a burnt sacrifice from the birds, you shall bring a turtle dove or a young pigeon. The priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off its head, and burn it on the altar, and its blood shall be drained out on the side of the altar. The priest shall remove its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east side, by the place of the ashes. He shall split it open, but not tear it completely apart, and the priest shall burn it on the altar, on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. When you bring a grain offering to the Lord, it shall be made of fine flour. You shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. You shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and the priest shall take a handful of the flour mixed with oil, along with all the frankincense, and burn it on the altar as a memorial offering, an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the offerings made by fire to the Lord. If you bring a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. If your offering is a grain offering cooked on a griddle, it shall be made of fine flour mixed with oil, and you shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering cooked in a pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. You shall bring the grain offering made of these things to the Lord, and when it is presented to the priest, he shall bring it to the altar. The priest shall take a memorial portion of the grain offering and burn it on the altar as an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the offerings made by fire to the Lord. No grain offering that you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven or honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. You may offer them to the Lord as an offering of first fruits, but they shall not be burned on the altar as a pleasing aroma. You shall season all your grain offerings with salt, and you shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. If you bring a grain offering of your first fruits to the Lord, you shall offer green heads of grain roasted by the fire, grain beaten from full heads. You shall put oil on it and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest shall burn the memorial portion of the beaten grain and the oil, along with all the frankincense, as an offering made by fire to the Lord. If your offering is a peace offering and you offer it from the herd, whether male or female, it must be without blemish before the Lord. You shall lay your hand on the head of your offering and kill it at the entrance of the tabernacle of the congregation. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around the altar. You shall offer the fat that covers the internal organs and all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the covering above the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood on the fire, as an offering made by fire, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. If your offering for a peace offering to the Lord is from the flock, whether male or female, it must be without blemish. If you offer a lamb for your offering, you shall present it before the Lord. You shall lay your hand on the head of your offering and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation, and Aaron's sons shall sprinkle its blood around the altar. You shall offer the fat, the entire fat tail close to the backbone, and the fat that covers the internal organs and all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, and the fat on them by the flanks, and the covering above the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire to the Lord. If your offering is a goat, you shall present it before the Lord, lay your hand on its head, and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation. Aaron's sons shall sprinkle its blood around the altar. You shall offer the fat that covers the internal organs, all the fat on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat on them by the flanks, and the covering above the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as food, an offering made by fire with a pleasing aroma. All the fat belongs to the Lord. This shall be a lasting ordinance for all generations, in all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, if anyone sins unintentionally by doing something against any of the commandments of the Lord that should not be done, they are guilty. If the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt upon the people, he must bring to the Lord a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. He shall bring the bull to the entrance of the tabernacle, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill it before the Lord. The anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle. He shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. The priest shall then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of the congregation. All the rest of the blood of the bull shall be poured out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest shall remove all the fat from the bull, including the fat that covers the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, and the fat on them near the flanks, and the covering above the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys, just as it was removed from the bull of the peace offering. The priest shall burn these on the altar of burnt offering. But the hide of the bull, all its flesh, its head, legs, internal organs, and dung, everything, shall be taken outside the camp to a clean place where the ashes are poured out and burned on the wood with fire. If the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally and it is hidden from the assembly's eyes, but they have done something against any of the Lord's commandments, they are guilty. When the sin they have committed becomes known, the congregation shall offer a young bull for the sin and bring it before the tabernacle. The elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the bull's head before the Lord, and it shall be killed before the Lord. The anointed priest shall bring some of the bull's blood to the tabernacle, dip his finger in the blood, and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. He shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle, and pour out all the blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering. He shall remove all the fat from it and burn it on the altar, just as he did with the first bull. The priest shall make atonement for the people, and they will be forgiven. The bull shall be taken outside the camp and burned just as the first bull was. This is the sin offering for the congregation. When a leader sins unintentionally by doing something against any of the commandments of the Lord, he is guilty. When he becomes aware of his sin, he shall bring as his offering a male goat without blemish. He shall lay his hand on the goat's head and kill it in the place where they kill the burnt offering before the Lord. It is a sin offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. He shall burn all the fat on the altar, just as the fat of the peace offering is burned. The priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin, and he will be forgiven. If any of the common people sins unintentionally by doing something against any of the Lord's commandments, they are guilty. When they become aware of their sin, they shall bring a female goat without blemish for their sin offering. They shall lay their hand on the head of the sin offering and kill it in the place of the burnt offering. The priest shall take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out all the blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The priest shall make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. If they bring a lamb for a sin offering, it must be a female without blemish. They shall lay their hand on the head of the sin offering and kill it as a sin offering in the place where they kill the burnt offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out all the blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove all the fat, just as the fat is removed from the lamb of the peace offerings, and the priest shall burn it on the altar, along with the offerings made by fire to the Lord. The priest shall make atonement for their sin, and they will be forgiven. If someone hears a public oath and is a witness, whether they have seen or known about it, but does not speak up, they shall bear their iniquity. If someone touches anything unclean, whether the carcass of an unclean animal or any unclean thing, and it is hidden from them, they are unclean and guilty. If they touch human uncleanness of any kind, and it is hidden from them, but later they become aware of it, they are guilty. If someone swears rashly with their lips to do evil or good, whatever it may be, and it is hidden from them, but they later become aware of it, they are guilty. When someone realizes they are guilty of any of these things, they must confess their sin. They shall bring as their guilt offering to the Lord a female from the flock, either a lamb or a goat, for a sin offering. The priest shall make atonement for them concerning their sin. If they cannot afford a lamb, they shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the Lord, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. They shall bring them to the priest, who shall offer the one for the sin offering first, wringing off its head, but not severing it. He shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, and the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. He shall then offer the second bird as a burnt offering according to the regulations. The priest shall make atonement for them for their sin, and they will be forgiven. If they cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, they shall bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a sin offering. They shall not put oil or frankincense on it, because it is a sin offering. They shall bring it to the priest, who shall take a handful of it as a memorial portion and burn it on the altar according to the offerings made by fire to the Lord. It is a sin offering. The priest shall make atonement for them for any of these sins they have committed, and they will be forgiven. The rest of the offering will belong to the priest, as with a grain offering. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "If someone commits a trespass and sins unintentionally regarding any of the holy things of the Lord, they shall bring a ram without blemish from the flock, valued in silver according to the sanctuary shekel, as a guilt offering. They must make restitution for what they have done wrong in regard to the holy thing, adding 1/5 of the value to it and giving it to the priest. The priest shall make atonement for them with the ram as a guilt offering, and they will be forgiven. If someone sins and does something forbidden by any of the Lord's commands, even if they are unaware of it, they are guilty and shall bear their iniquity. They shall bring a ram without blemish from the flock, according to the value determined, as a guilt offering to the priest. The priest shall make atonement for them for the sin they committed unintentionally, and they will be forgiven. This is a guilt offering, for they have certainly committed a trespass against the Lord." The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "If anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving their neighbor regarding something entrusted to them, or by cheating, stealing, or lying about something they found, or if they swear falsely about anything they have done, they are guilty. When they realize their guilt, they must return what they stole or took by deception, or what was entrusted to them. or what they found, or whatever they swore falsely about. They must make full restitution and add a fifth of the value to it, giving it to the rightful owner on the day they present their guilt offering. They must bring a guilt offering to the Lord, a ram without blemish from the flock, according to the value determined, and give it to the priest. The priest will make atonement for them before the Lord, and they will be forgiven for any of the things they did that made them guilty. The Lord spoke to Moses again, saying, "Give this command to Aaron and his sons. This is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering must remain on the altar hearth all night until morning, and the fire of the altar must be kept burning. The priest shall dress in his linen clothes, including linen undergarments, and remove the ashes of the burnt offering that the fire has consumed on the altar, and place them beside the altar. Then he shall take off these garments and put on others, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest is to add wood to the fire, arrange the burnt offering on it, and burn the fat of the peace offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. This is the law of the grain offering. Aaron's sons shall present it before the Lord in front of the altar. The priest shall take a handful of the fine flour mixed with oil, along with all the frankincense, and burn it on the altar as a memorial portion, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Aaron and his sons are to eat the rest of it, but it must be eaten without yeast in a holy place, in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. It is not to be baked with yeast. It is their share of the offerings made by fire to the Lord, and it is most holy, just like the sin offering and the guilt offering. Any male descendant of Aaron may eat it. It is his perpetual share of the offerings made by fire to the Lord. Whatever touches them will become holy. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This is the offering that Aaron and his sons are to bring to the Lord on the day he is anointed: 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour as a regular grain offering, half in the morning and half in the evening. It must be prepared with oil on a griddle and brought well mixed and presented as a grain offering broken into pieces, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. The son who is to succeed him as anointed priest shall prepare it. It is the Lord's permanent share and is to be burned completely. Every grain offering of a priest shall be burned completely. It must not be eaten." The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the sin offering. The sin offering shall be slaughtered before the Lord in the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. It is most holy. The priest who offers it shall eat it. It must be eaten in a holy place, in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. Whatever touches the flesh of the sin offering will become holy, and if any of the blood is splashed on a garment, you must wash it in a holy place. The clay pot in which the sin offering was cooked must be broken, but if it was cooked in a bronze pot, the pot must be scoured and rinsed with water. Any male among the priests may eat it. It is most holy. But any sin offering whose blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place must not be eaten. It must be burned with fire. This is the law of the guilt offering, which is most holy. The guilt offering is to be slaughtered in the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered, and its blood is to be sprinkled on the altar on all sides. All the fat shall be offered, the fat tail and the fat that covers the internal organs, both kidneys with the fat on them near the loins, and the long lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall burn them on the altar as a food offering presented to the Lord. It is a guilt offering. Any male among the priests may eat it, but it must be eaten in a holy place. It is most holy. The same law applies to both the sin offering and the guilt offering. It belongs to the priest who makes atonement with it. The priest who offers a burnt offering for anyone may keep the hide of the burnt offering he has offered. Every grain offering baked in an oven or cooked in a pan or griddle belongs to the priest who offers it, and every grain offering, whether mixed with oil or dry, belongs equally to all the sons of Aaron. This is the law of the peace offering that someone may present to the Lord. If they offer it as an expression of thankfulness, then along with this thank offering they are to offer thick loaves made without yeast and with olive oil mixed in, thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with oil, and thick loaves of the finest flour well mixed with oil. Along with their fellowship offering of thanksgiving, they are to present an offering with thick loaves of bread made with yeast. They are to bring one of each kind as an offering, a contribution to the Lord. It belongs to the priest who splashes the blood of the fellowship offering against the altar. The meat of the fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day it is offered. None of it may be left until morning. If, however, their offering is the result of a vow or is a free will offering, the sacrifice shall be eaten on the day they offer it, but anything left over may be eaten on the next day. Any meat of the sacrifice left over until the third day must be burned up. If any meat of the fellowship offering is eaten on the third day, it will not be accepted. It will not be credited to the one who offered it, for it is impure. The person who eats it will be held responsible. Meat that touches anything ceremonially unclean must not be eaten. It must be burned up. As for other meat, anyone ceremonially clean may eat it. But if anyone who is unclean eats any meat of the fellowship offering belonging to the Lord, they must be cut off from their people. Anyone who touches something unclean, whether human uncleanness or an unclean animal or any unclean creature that moves along the ground, and then eats any of the meat of the fellowship offering belonging to the Lord must be cut off from their people. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the Israelites, do not eat any of the fat of cattle, sheep, or goats. The fat of an animal found dead or torn by wild animals may be used for any other purpose, but you must not eat it. Anyone who eats the fat of an animal from which a food offering may be presented to the Lord must be cut off from their people. And wherever you live, you must not eat the blood of any bird or animal. Anyone who eats blood must be cut off from their people." The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the Israelites, anyone who brings a fellowship offering to the Lord is to bring part of it as their sacrifice to the Lord. With their own hands, they are to present the food offering to the Lord. They are to bring the fat, together with the breast, and wave the breast before the Lord as a wave offering. The priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons. You are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priest as a contribution. The son of Aaron who offers the blood and the fat of the fellowship offering shall have the right thigh as his share. From the fellowship offerings of the Israelites, I have taken the breast that is waved and the thigh that is presented, and have given them to Aaron the priest and his sons as their perpetual share from the Israelites. This is the portion of the food offerings presented to the Lord that were allotted to Aaron and his sons on the day they were presented to serve the Lord as priests. On the day they were anointed, the Lord commanded that the Israelites give this to them as their perpetual share for the generations to come. These, then, are the regulations for the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the ordination offering, and the fellowship offering, which the Lord gave Moses at Mount Sinai on the day he commanded the Israelites to bring their offerings to the Lord in the desert of Sinai. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take Aaron and his sons with him, along with the garments, the anointing oil, a bull for the sin offering, 2 rams, and a basket of unleavened bread. Gather the entire congregation at the entrance of the tabernacle." Moses did as the Lord commanded, and the assembly gathered at the entrance of the tabernacle. Moses then said to the congregation, "This is what the Lord has commanded to be done." Moses brought Aaron and his sons forward and washed them with water. He dressed Aaron in the tunic, tied the sash around him, clothed him with the robe, and placed the ephod on him. He fastened the ephod with its decorative waistband and tied it around him. He placed the breastpiece on him and put the Urim and Thummim in the breastpiece. He set the turban on Aaron's head and placed the gold plate, the holy crown, on the front of the turban, as the Lord had commanded. Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the tabernacle and everything in it, consecrating them. He sprinkled some of the oil on the altar 7 times, anointing the altar and all its utensils, as well as the basin and its stand, to consecrate them. He poured some of the anointing oil on Aaron's head to consecrate him. Moses then brought Aaron's sons forward, dressed them in tunics, tied sashes around them, and put headbands on them, as the Lord had commanded. Next, Moses brought the bull for the sin offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on its head. Moses slaughtered the bull and took some of the blood, and with his finger he put it on all the horns of the altar to purify it. He poured out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar and consecrated it to make atonement for it. He also took all the fat from the internal organs, the long lobe of the liver, and both kidneys with their fat, and burned it on the altar. But the bull, its hide, flesh, and intestines, he burned outside the camp, as the Lord had commanded. Moses then brought the ram for the burnt offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on its head. Moses slaughtered the ram and sprinkled the blood on all sides of the altar. He cut the ram into pieces and burned the head, the pieces, and the fat. He washed the internal organs and the legs with water, and burned the entire ram on the altar as a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord, as the Lord had commanded. Moses then brought the other ram, the ram of ordination, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on its head. Moses slaughtered the ram and took some of its blood, putting it on the lobe of Aaron's right ear, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. He brought Aaron's sons forward and put some of the blood on the lobes of their right ears, on the thumbs of their right hands, and on the big toes of their right feet. Then Moses sprinkled the blood on all sides of the altar. He took the fat tail, all the fat around the internal organs, the long lobe of the liver, both kidneys and their fat, and the right thigh. From the basket of unleavened bread before the Lord, he took 1 thick loaf without yeast, 1 thick loaf with oil, and 1 wafer, and placed them on the fat portions and on the right thigh. He put all these in the hands of Aaron and his sons, and waved them before the Lord as a wave offering. Then Moses took them from their hands, and burned them on the altar with the burnt offering as an ordination offering, a pleasing aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord. He also took the breast, Moses' share of the ordination ram, and waved it before the Lord as a wave offering, as the Lord had commanded. Moses took some of the anointing oil and some of the blood from the altar and sprinkled it on Aaron and his garments, and on his sons and their garments. So he consecrated Aaron and his garments, and his sons and their garments. Moses then said to Aaron and his sons, "Cook the meat at the entrance to the tabernacle, and eat it there with the bread from the basket of ordination offerings, as I commanded, saying, Aaron and his sons are to eat it. Then burn up the rest of the meat and the bread. Do not leave the entrance to the tabernacle for 7 days, until the days of your ordination are completed, for your ordination will last 7 days. What has been done today was commanded by the Lord to make atonement for you. Stay at the entrance of the tabernacle day and night for 7 days, and keep the Lord's charge so that you will not die, for that is what I have been commanded." Aaron and his sons did everything the Lord commanded through Moses. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, "Take a calf for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and present them before the Lord. Then speak to the Israelites, saying, Take a male goat for a sin offering, a calf and a lamb, both a year old and without defect, for a burnt offering, and an ox and a ram for a fellowship offering to sacrifice before the Lord, together with a grain offering mixed with oil. For today the Lord will appear to you." They brought what Moses commanded to the front of the tabernacle, and the entire congregation came near and stood before the Lord. Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you." Moses said to Aaron, "Come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and the people. Sacrifice the offering that is for the people and make atonement for them, as the Lord has commanded." So Aaron came to the altar and slaughtered the calf as a sin offering for himself. His sons brought him the blood, and he dipped his finger in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar. He poured out the blood at the base of the altar. But the fat, the kidneys, and the long lobe of the liver from the sin offering he burned on the altar, as the Lord commanded Moses. The flesh and the hide he burned outside the camp. Then he slaughtered the burnt offering. His sons handed him the blood, and he sprinkled it against all sides of the altar. They handed him the burnt offering piece by piece, including the head, and he burned them on the altar. He washed the internal organs and the legs and burned them on top of the burnt offering on the altar. Next, Aaron brought the offering that was for the people. He took the goat for the people's sin offering and slaughtered it and offered it for sin, as he did with the first one. He brought the burnt offering and offered it according to the prescribed way. He also brought the grain offering, took a handful of it, and burned it on the altar, in addition to the morning's burnt offering. He slaughtered the ox and the ram as the fellowship offering for the people. His sons handed him the blood, and he sprinkled it against all sides of the altar. But the fat portions of the ox and the ram, the fat tail, the layer of fat, the kidneys, and the long lobe of the liver, these they laid on the breasts, and Aaron burned the fat on the altar. Aaron waved the breasts and the right thigh before the Lord as a wave offering, as Moses commanded. Then Aaron lifted his hands toward the people and blessed them. Having sacrificed the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the fellowship offering, he stepped down. Moses and Aaron then went into the tabernacle of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell face down. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense, and they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.'" Aaron remained silent. Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come here, carry your cousins outside the camp, away from the front of the sanctuary." So they came and carried them, still in their tunics, outside the camp, as Moses ordered. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not let your hair become unkempt, and do not tear your clothes, or you will die, and the Lord will be angry with the whole community. But your relatives, all the Israelites, may mourn for those the Lord has destroyed by fire. Do not leave the entrance to the tabernacle, or you will die, because the Lord's anointing oil is on you." So they did as Moses said. Then the Lord said to Aaron, "You and your sons are not to drink wine or other fermented drink whenever you go into the tabernacle, or you will die. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, so that you can distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean, and so you can teach the Israelites all the decrees the Lord has given them through Moses." Moses said to Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, "Take the grain offering left over from the food offerings prepared without yeast and presented to the Lord, and eat it beside the altar, for it is most holy. Eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is your share and your son's share of the food offerings presented to the Lord. For so I have been commanded. But you and your sons and your daughters may eat the breast that was waved and the thigh that was presented. Eat them in a ceremonially clean place. They have been given to you and your children as your share of the Israelites' fellowship offerings. The thigh that was presented and the breast that was waved must be brought with the fat portions of the food offerings, to be waved before the Lord as a wave offering. This will be the perpetual share for you and your children, as the Lord has commanded." When Moses inquired about the goat of the sin offering and found that it had been burned up, he was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and asked, "Why didn't you eat the sin offering in the sanctuary area? It is most holy. It was given to you to take away the guilt of the community by making atonement for them before the Lord. Since its blood was not taken into the holy place, you should have eaten the goat in the sanctuary area, as I commanded." Aaron replied to Moses, "Today they sacrificed their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, but such things as this have happened to me. Would the Lord have been pleased if I had eaten the sin offering today?" When Moses heard this, he was satisfied. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Tell the Israelites that these are the animals they may eat among all the animals on the earth. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. However, you must not eat the following animals, even if they chew the cud or have a divided hoof: the camel, because it chews the cud, but does not have a divided hoof, it is unclean for you; the coney, because it chews the cud, but does not have a divided hoof, it is unclean for you; the hare, because it chews the cud, but does not have a divided hoof, it is unclean for you; and the pig, though it has a divided hoof, it does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses, they are unclean for you. Of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or rivers that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things in the water or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. You are to detest them, and you must not eat their meat. You must detest their carcasses because they are unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. These are the birds you are to regard as unclean and must not eat because they are unclean: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects that walk on all fours are to be regarded as unclean by you. However, you may eat those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper, but all other flying insects that have 4 legs are to be regarded as unclean by you. You will become unclean by touching their carcasses. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until evening. Every animal that has a divided hoof but is not cloven-footed or does not chew the cud is unclean for you. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. And all animals that walk on their paws, among those that walk on all fours, are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until evening. These animals are unclean for you. Among the creatures that move along the ground, these are unclean for you: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean until evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article becomes unclean, whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Whatever it is used for, it must be put into water, and it will be unclean until evening. Then it will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a pot is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. If an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash their clothes, and they will be unclean until evening. Every creature that moves along the ground is to be regarded as unclean. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves along the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is unclean. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. I am the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals birds, every living thing that moves in the water, and every creature that moves along the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the Israelites, when a woman gives birth and has a son, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until her purification is completed. If she gives birth to a daughter, she will be unclean for 2 weeks, as during her period. Then she must wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. When the days of her purification for a son or daughter are over, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or a dove for a sin offering. He shall offer them before the Lord to make atonement for her, and she will be ceremonially clean from her flow of blood. These are the regulations for the woman who gives birth to a boy or a girl. If she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. In this way the priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When anyone has a swelling or a rash or a shiny spot on their skin that may be a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on the skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling skin disease. When the priest examines that person, he shall pronounce them ceremonially unclean. If the shiny spot on the skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine them, and if he sees that the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he is to isolate them for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine them again, and if the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a rash. They must wash their clothes and be clean. But if the rash does spread in their skin after they have shown themselves to the priest to be pronounced clean, they must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine that person, and if the rash has spread in the skin, he shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. When anyone has a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine them, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce them unclean. They are not to isolate them, because they are already unclean. If the disease breaks out all over their skin, and so far as the priest can see, it covers all the skin of the affected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine them, and if the disease has covered their whole body, he shall pronounce them clean. Since it has all turned white, they are clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on them, they will be unclean. When the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce them unclean. The raw flesh is unclean. They have a defiling disease. If the raw flesh changes and turns white, they must go to the priest. The priest is to examine them, and if the sores have turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean, then they will be clean. When someone has a boil on their skin and it heals, and in the place where the boil was, a white swelling or reddish-white spot appears, they must present themselves to the priest. The priest is to examine it, and if it appears to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce that person unclean. It is a defiling skin disease that has broken out where the boil was. But if, when the priest examines it, there is no white hair in it, and it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling disease. But if the spot is unchanged and has not spread, it is only a scar from the boil, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When someone has a burn on their skin, and a reddish white or white spot appears in the raw flesh of the burn, the priest is to examine the spot, and if the hair in it has turned white, and it appears to be more than skin deep, It is a defiling disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. But if the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in the spot, and it is not more than skin deep and has faded, the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine that person, and if it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. If, however, the spot is unchanged and has not spread in the skin but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a scar from the burn. If a man or woman has a sore on their head or chin, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it appears to be more than skin deep and the hair in it is yellow and thin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease on the head or chin. But if, when the priest examines the sore, it does not seem to be more than skin deep and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it and it does not appear to be more than skin deep, the person must shave themselves, except for the diseased area, and the priest is to isolate them for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it has not spread in the skin and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest shall pronounce them clean. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the sore does spread in the skin after they are pronounced clean, the priest is to examine them, and if he finds that the sore has spread in the skin, he does not need to look for yellow hair. They are unclean. If, however, the sore is unchanged so far as the priest can see and black hair has grown in it, the affected person is healed. They are clean, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, and if the spots are dull white, it is a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. They are clean. A man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. If he has lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. But if he has a reddish-white sore on his bald head or forehead, it is a defiling disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest is to examine him, and if the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish-white like a defiling skin disease, the man is diseased and is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head.
Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. As for any fabric that has a defiling mold, be it woolen or linen clothing, woven or knitted material of linen or wool, leather or anything made of leather, if the affected area in the fabric, the leather, the woven or knitted material, or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is a defiling mold and must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the affected area and isolate the article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it, and if the mold has spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material, or the leather, whatever its use, it is a persistent defiling mold. The article is unclean. He must burn the fabric, the woven or knitted material of wool or linen, or any leather article that has the affected area, because the defiling mold is persistent. The article must be burned. But if, when the priest examines it, the mold has not spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material, or the leather article, he shall order that the spoiled article be washed. Then he is to isolate it for another 7 days. After the affected article has been washed, the priest is to examine it again, and if the mold has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. Burn it, no matter which side of the fabric has been spoiled. If, when the priest examines it, the mold has faded after the article has been washed, he is to tear the spoiled part out of the fabric, the leather, or the woven or knitted material. But if it reappears in the fabric, in the woven or knitted material, or in the leather article, it is a spreading mold. Whatever has the mold must be burned. Any fabric, woven or knitted material, or any leather article that has been washed and is rid of the mold must be washed again. Then it will be clean. These are the regulations concerning defiling molds in woolen or linen clothing, woven or knitted material, or any leather article, for pronouncing them clean or unclean. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This is the law for someone with a skin disease on the day of their cleansing. They must be brought to the priest, who will go outside the camp to examine them. If the person is found to be healed of the skin disease, the priest will order 2 clean, live birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop to be brought for the cleansing. The priest will then have one of the birds killed over fresh water in a clay pot. He will take the live bird along with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. The priest will sprinkle the blood 7 times on the person to be cleansed, and then pronounce them clean. The live bird will be released into the open field. The person to be cleansed must wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe with water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. After that, they may enter the camp, but they must stay outside their tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must shave off all their hair, their head, beard, eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water, and then they will be clean. On the 8th day, the person must take 2 male lambs without defect, and a year-old ewe lamb without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. The priest who performs the cleansing will present the person to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest will take one of the male lambs and offer it as a guilt offering, along with the log of oil, and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. He will then slaughter the lamb in the holy place where the sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered. The guilt offering belongs to the priest, as does the sin offering. It is most holy. The priest will take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person to be cleansed. The priest will also pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand and dip his right finger into the oil in his palm, sprinkling it 7 times before the Lord. The priest will put some of the oil remaining in his palm on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person to be cleansed, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm the priest will put on the head of the person to be cleansed to make atonement for them before the Lord.
Then the priest will sacrifice the sin offering to make atonement for the person to be cleansed from their uncleanness. After that, the priest will slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar along with the grain offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them, and they will be clean. If the person is poor and cannot afford these offerings, they must take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for them, along with 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, a log of oil, and 2 doves or 2 young pigeons which they can afford, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day, they must bring them for their cleansing to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest will take the lamb for the guilt offering, along with the log of oil, and wave them before the Lord as a wave offering. The priest will slaughter the lamb and take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person to be cleansed. The priest will pour some of the oil into the palm of his own left hand, sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord with his right finger, and put some of the oil on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person to be cleansed, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. The rest of the oil in his palm, the priest will put on the head of the person to be cleansed, to make atonement for them before the Lord. Then the priest will offer one of the doves or young pigeons, whichever the person can afford, as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, along with the grain offering. In this way the priest will make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the person to be cleansed. These are the regulations for anyone who has a defiling skin disease and cannot afford the regular offerings for their cleansing. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your possession, and I put a spreading mildew in a house in that land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, 'I have seen something that looks like mildew in my house.' The priest is to order the house to be emptied before he goes in to examine the mildew, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mildew on the walls, and if it has greenish or reddish depressions that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out of the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall return to inspect the house. If the mildew has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped, and the plaster that is scraped off must be dumped into an unclean place outside the town. Then they are to take other stones to replace these and take new clay and plaster the house. If the mildew reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house scraped and plastered, the priest is to go and examine it, and if the mildew has spread in the house, it is a persistent mildew. The house is unclean. It must be torn down, its stones, timbers, and all the plaster, and taken out of the town to an unclean place. Anyone who goes into the house while it is closed up will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash their clothes. But if the priest comes to examine it, and the mildew has not spread after the house has been plastered, he shall pronounce the house clean, because the mildew is gone. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. He shall kill one of the birds over fresh water in a clay pot. Then he is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird, dip them into the blood of the dead bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He shall purify the house with the bird's blood, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird in the open fields outside the town. In this way, he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. These are the regulations for any defiling skin disease, for a sore, for mildew in clothing or in a house, and for a swelling, a rash, or a shiny spot, to determine when something is clean or unclean. These are the regulations for defiling skin diseases and mildew. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, the discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing or is blocked, it is unclean. Any bed the man with the discharge lies on will be unclean, and anything he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sits on something that the man with the discharge sat on must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the man with the discharge must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, they must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Everything the man sits on when riding will be unclean, and whoever touches any of the things that were under him will be unclean until evening. Whoever picks up those things must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Anyone the man with the discharge touches without rinsing his hands with water must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. A clay pot that the man touches must be broken, and any wooden article is to be rinsed with water. When a man is cleansed from his discharge, he must count off 7 days for his ceremonial cleansing. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with fresh water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord to the entrance to the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement before the Lord for the man because of his discharge. When a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather that has semen on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean until evening. When a man has sexual relations with a woman and there is an emission of semen, both of them must bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. When a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed or anything she sits on must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. If a man has sexual relations with her and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement for her before the Lord for the uncleanness of her discharge. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. These are the regulations for a man with a discharge, for anyone made unclean by an emission of semen, for a woman in her monthly period, for anyone with a discharge, whether male or female, and for a man who has sexual relations with a woman who is ceremonially unclean. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, who died when they approached the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he must not enter the most holy place behind the curtain whenever he chooses, or he will die, because I appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. Aaron is to enter the most holy place with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He is to wear the sacred linen tunic, with linen undergarments next to his body, tie the linen sash around him, and put on the linen turban. These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on.
Aaron is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering from the Israelite community. He is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. Aaron shall then offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. He is to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering and take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and take them behind the curtain. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the mercy seat above the tablets of the covenant law, so that he will not die. He is to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat. Then he shall sprinkle some of it with his finger 7 times before the mercy seat. He shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people, and take its blood behind the curtain, and do with it as he did with the bull's blood. He shall sprinkle it on the mercy seat and in front of it. In this way he will make atonement for the most holy place because of the uncleanness and rebellion of the Israelites, whatever their sins have been. He is to do the same for the tent of meeting, which is among them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one is to be in the tent of meeting from the time Aaron goes in to make atonement in the most holy place until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He shall take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on all the horns of the altar. He shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the Israelites. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the wilderness in the care of someone appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a remote place, and the man shall release it into the wilderness. Then Aaron is to go into the tent of meeting and take off the linen garments he put on before he entered the most holy place, and he is to leave them there. He shall bathe himself with water in a holy place and put on his regular garments. Then he shall come out and sacrifice the burnt offering for himself and the burnt offering for the people, to make atonement for himself and for the people. He shall also burn the fat of the sin offering on the altar. The man who releases the goat as a scapegoat must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. Afterward he may come into the camp. The bull and the goat for the sin offerings, whose blood was brought into the most holy place to make atonement, must be taken outside the camp. Their hides, flesh and intestines are to be burned up. The man who burns them must wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. Afterward he may come into the camp. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. On the 10th day of the 7th month you must deny yourselves and do no work, whether native-born or a foreigner residing among you, because on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then, before the Lord, you will be clean from all your sins. It is a day of Sabbath rest, and you must deny yourselves. It is a lasting ordinance. The priest who is anointed and ordained to succeed his father as high priest is to make atonement. He is to put on the sacred linen garments and make atonement for the most holy place, for the tent of meeting and the altar, and for the priests and all the members of the community. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites. And it was done as the Lord commanded Moses.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron his sons and all the Israelites, and say to them, This is what the Lord has commanded. Any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord, must be considered guilty of bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from their people. This is so the Israelites will bring to the Lord the sacrifices they are now making in the open fields. They must bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting and sacrifice them as fellowship offerings to the Lord. The priest is to splash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting and burn the fat as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. They must no longer offer any of their sacrifices to the goat idols, to whom they prostitute themselves. This is to be a lasting ordinance for them and for the generations to come. Say to them, Any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord must be cut off from the people of Israel. Any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who eats blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut them off from their people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore, I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood. Any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain out the blood and cover it with earth, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. Anyone, whether native-born or foreigner, who eats anything found dead or torn by wild animals must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be ceremonially unclean until evening. Then they will be clean. But if they do not wash their clothes and bathe themselves, they will be held responsible. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites and tell them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and my judgments, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord. Do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. That would dishonor your father. Do not have sexual relations with your sister, whether she is your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether she was born in the same home or elsewhere. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter. That would dishonor you. Do not have sexual relations with the daughter of your father's wife, born to your father. She is your sister. Do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. She is your father's close relative. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister, because she is your mother's close relative. Do not dishonor your father's brother by approaching his wife to have sexual relations. She is your aunt. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. Do not have relations with her. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. That would dishonor your brother. Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. Do not have sexual relations with either her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. They are her close relatives. It is wickedness. Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, for this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native-born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. Keep my requirements, and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make metal gods for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you sacrifice a fellowship offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it, or on the next day. Anything left over until the third day must be burned up. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it is impure and will not be accepted. Whoever eats it will be held responsible because they have desecrated what is holy to the Lord. They must be cut off from their people. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. If a man has sexual relations with a female slave who is promised to another man, but who has not been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death, because she had not been freed. The man, however, must bring a ram to the entrance to the tent of meeting for a guilt offering to the Lord. With the ram of the guilt offering, the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for the sin he has committed, and his sin will be forgiven. When you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years you are to consider it forbidden. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year all its fruit will be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat its fruit. In this way your harvest will be increased. I am the Lord your God. Do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Stand up in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of their children to Molech is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone them. I myself will set my face against them and will cut them off from their people. For by sacrificing their children to Molech, they have defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. If the members of the community close their eyes when that person sacrifices a child to Molech, and if they fail to put them to death, I myself will set my face against them and their family, and will cut them off from their people together with all who follow them in prostituting themselves to Molech. I will set my face against anyone who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute themselves by following them, and I will cut them off from their people. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and follow them. I am the Lord who makes you holy. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. Because they have cursed their father or mother, their blood will be on their own head. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death. If a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, both of them are to be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wickedness. Both he and they must be burned in the fire, so that no wickedness will be among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he is to be put to death, and you must kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal to have sexual relations with it, kill both the woman and the animal. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. They are to be publicly removed from their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible. If a man has sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period, he has exposed the source of her flow, and she has also uncovered it. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. Do not have sexual relations with the sister of either your mother or your father, for that would dishonor a close relative. both of you would be held responsible. If a man has sexual relations with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible. They will die childless. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. Keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that the land where I am bringing you to live may not vomit you out. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. But I said to you, you will possess their land. I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, and between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground, those that I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. A man or woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Tell the priests, the sons of Aaron, that they should not defile themselves by touching a dead body among their people, except for close relatives such as their mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or an unmarried sister who is dependent on him. However, they must not make themselves unclean as leaders among their people by profaning themselves. They shall not shave their heads, trim the edges of their beards, or make any cuts on their bodies. They must be holy to their God, and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the food offerings to the Lord. Therefore, they must be holy. They must not marry a woman who is a prostitute, or who has been divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. You must regard him as holy because he offers the food of your God. He must be holy to you because I, the Lord, who make you holy, am holy. If a priest's daughter defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she disgraces her father and must be burned with fire. The high priest, who is anointed with oil and consecrated to wear the sacred garments, must not let his hair become unkempt or tear his clothes. He must not go near any dead body or defile himself, even for his father or mother. He must not leave the sanctuary or desecrate it, for the anointing oil of his God is upon him. He must marry a woman who is a virgin. He must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, or a woman who has been defiled or a prostitute. He must marry a virgin from his own people. He must not defile his offspring among his people, for the Lord sanctifies him. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Tell Aaron that no one of his descendants who has any physical defect may come near to offer the food of his God. Any man with a physical defect must not approach to offer the food of his God. This includes a man who is blind, lame, has a disfigured face, or any deformity. It also includes a man with a crippled foot or hand, a hunchback, a dwarf, someone with an eye defect, or who has sores or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron who has a defect may come near to present the offerings made by fire to the Lord. Though he may eat the most holy food of his God, he must not go near the curtain or approach the altar because of his defect, so that he does not desecrate the sanctuary. Moses told this to Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites. The Lord spoke to Moses, telling him to instruct Aaron and his sons to treat the sacred offerings with respect, so they do not profane his holy name. If any of Aaron's descendants has a contagious skin disease or discharge, he may not eat the sacred offerings until he is clean. Anyone who touches something defiled by a dead body, or a man who has had an emission of semen, or who touches any unclean creature or person, will be unclean until evening. He must wash himself with water, and after sunset he may eat the sacred offerings, for they are his food. However, he must not eat anything found dead or torn by wild animals, as this would make him unclean. The priests must keep God's requirements so that they do not become guilty and die for treating the sacred offerings with contempt. No one outside the priest's family may eat the sacred offerings. However, a slave bought by the priest or born in his household may eat his food. If a priest's daughter marries someone outside the priest's family, she may no longer eat the sacred offerings. But if she becomes a widow or is divorced and has no children, she may return to her father's house and eat his food as in her youth. Anyone who eats a sacred offering unintentionally must make restitution by adding 1/5 of its value and giving it to the priest. The Lord spoke to Moses, instructing him to tell Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites that any Israelite or foreigner who brings an offering to the Lord must bring a male without defect from the cattle, sheep, or goats. It must have no defect to be acceptable. Animals with defects must not be offered, as they will not be accepted. Similarly, no animal that is blind, injured, maimed, or has any defect such as festering or running sores must be offered. Even a free will offering from an animal with a deformity is acceptable, but it cannot be used to fulfill a vow. Animals that have been bruised, crushed, torn, or cut must not be offered. When a calf, lamb, or goat is born, it must remain with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day onward, it will be acceptable as an offering made by fire to the Lord. However, an animal and its young must not be slaughtered on the same day. When you bring a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It must be eaten on the same day. None of it must be left until morning. You must keep God's commandments and follow them. Do not profane God's holy name, for he must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. He is the Lord, who made them holy and brought them out of Egypt to be their God. He is the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses and instructed him to tell the Israelites about the special feasts they were to observe, which were holy gatherings. He said that for 6 days work should be done, but the 7th day was a Sabbath of rest, a holy gathering. No work was to be done on that day, as it was a Sabbath to the Lord. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, which they were to proclaim as holy gatherings at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the 1st month at twilight, they were to observe the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month, they were to begin the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days, they were to eat bread without yeast. On the 1st day, they were to hold a holy gathering and do no regular work. For 7 days, they were to present offerings by fire to the Lord, and on the 7th day, they were to hold another holy gathering and do no regular work. The Lord told Moses to instruct the Israelites that when they entered the land he was giving them and reaped its harvest, they were to bring the first sheaf of their harvest to the priest. The priest would wave the sheaf before the Lord so that it would be accepted on their behalf. This was to be done on the day after the Sabbath. On that day, they were to offer a year-old lamb without defect as a burnt offering to the Lord, along with a grain offering of fine flour mixed with oil and a drink offering of wine. They were not to eat any bread or roasted or new grain until they had brought this offering to God. They were also to count 7 weeks from the day after the Sabbath, when they brought the sheaf of the wave offering, until the day after the 7th Sabbath, making 50 days. Then, they were to present a new grain offering to the Lord. They were to bring 2 loaves made from fine flour, baked with yeast, as the first fruits offering to the Lord. Along with the bread, they were to offer 7-year-old lambs without defect, 1 young bull, and 2 rams as burnt offerings to the Lord, along with their grain and drink offerings. These were offerings made by fire, pleasing to the Lord. They were also to sacrifice a male goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs for a fellowship offering. The priest was to wave these along with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before the Lord. These were to be holy to the Lord and belong to the priest. On that same day, they were to hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This was to be a lasting ordinance for all generations, wherever they lived. When they reaped the harvest of their land, they were not to harvest the edges of their fields or gather the gleanings, but leave them for the poor and the foreigner. The Lord spoke to Moses again, instructing him to tell the Israelites that on the 1st day of the 7th month they were to observe a day of rest, a sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. They were to do no regular work and present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 10th day of the 7th month they were to observe the Day of Atonement, a sacred assembly where they were to deny themselves and present an offering by fire to the Lord. They were not to do any work on that day, as it was the Day of Atonement, when atonement was made for them before the Lord. Anyone who did not deny themselves on that day was to be cut off from their people. Anyone who did any work on that day was to be destroyed. This was to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come in all their dwellings. It was a Sabbath of rest, and they were to observe it from the evening of the 9th day until the following evening. The Lord also instructed Moses to tell the Israelites that on the 15th day of the 7th month, they were to begin the Feast of Tabernacles, which would last for 7 days. The first day was to be a sacred assembly, and no regular work was to be done. For 7 days, they were to present offerings by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day, they were to hold another sacred assembly and present an offering by fire to the Lord. This was to be a solemn assembly, and no regular work was to be done. These were the Lord's appointed feasts, which they were to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing offerings by fire to the Lord, along with the regular Sabbaths and offerings they were to bring. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when they gathered the harvest, they were to celebrate a festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day was to be a day of rest, and the 8th day was also to be a day of rest. They were to take branches from luxuriant trees, palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord for 7 days. This was to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come. The Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during this feast, so that future generations would remember that God made the Israelites live in shelters when He brought them out of Egypt. The Lord also told Moses to instruct the Israelites to bring pure olive oil for the lamps, so that they would burn continually in the tent of meeting, outside the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant. Aaron was to keep the lamps burning before the Lord from evening till morning continually. They were also to bake 12 loaves of bread from fine flour and set them in 2 rows, 6 in each row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. They were to put pure frankincense on each row as a memorial portion to be burned as an offering to the Lord. This bread was to be set out every Sabbath, and Aaron and his sons were to eat it in a holy place, as it was most holy and belonged to them as their share of the offerings made by fire to the Lord. An incident occurred where the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, got into a fight with an Israelite man. During the fight, the son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name of the Lord with a curse. He was brought to Moses, who inquired of the Lord. The Lord instructed Moses to bring the man outside the camp, and those who heard him blaspheme were to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly was to stone him to death. This was to be a law for all. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord was to be put to death, whether they were a foreigner or native-born. The Lord also decreed that anyone who kills another person must be put to death. Anyone who kills someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. If anyone injures their neighbor, they are to be injured in the same way, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As they have injured another, so they are to be injured. The same law applies to both the foreigner and the native-born. The people did as the Lord commanded Moses, taking the man who had cursed outside the camp and stoning him to death. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, instructing him to tell the Israelites that when they enter the land He is giving them, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years, they are to sow their fields, prune their vineyards, and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. During this year, they are not to sow their fields or prune their vineyards. Whatever the land produces during this time is for them, their servants, hired workers, and even their livestock and wild animals. They are also to count 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, totaling 49 years. Then, on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement, they are to sound the trumpet throughout the land and declare the 50th year as a jubilee. During the jubilee year, everyone is to return to their own property and family. The land is to rest during this year, and they are not to sow or reap what grows on its own. This year is to be holy to them, and they are to eat only what the land produces on its own. If they sell or buy property from each other, they are not to oppress one another. The price of the property should be based on the number of years until the next jubilee. If many years remain, the price should be higher. If few years remain, the price should be lower. They are to respect and fear their God by observing his statutes and keeping his judgments so that they may live securely in the land, which will yield its fruit and provide for them. If they wonder what they will eat during the 7th year when they cannot sow or gather their crops, the Lord promises to bless them in the 6th year with enough produce to last for 3 years. They can sow again in the 8th year and eat from the old produce until the new harvest comes in the 9th year. The land must not be sold permanently because it belongs to the Lord. The Israelites are only strangers and tenants in it. Throughout the land they hold as a possession, they must allow for the redemption of property. If one of their fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to redeem what they have sold. If the seller has no one to redeem it but later becomes able to do so, they are to calculate the years since the sale and pay back the balance to the buyer so they can return to their property. If they cannot redeem it, the property will remain with the buyer until the Jubilee year, when it will be returned to the original owner. If someone sells a house in a walled city, they have the right to redeem it within a year. If it is not redeemed within that time, the house in the walled city becomes the permanent property of the buyer. However, houses in villages without walls are considered like open fields and can be redeemed and returned in the Jubilee year. The houses in the cities of the Levites can always be redeemed, and any property they sell will be returned in the Jubilee year. The fields around their towns cannot be sold because they are their permanent possession. If any of their fellow Israelites becomes poor and is unable to support themselves, they must help them as they would a foreigner or stranger, so they can continue to live among them. They are not to charge interest or make a profit from them, but fear God and let their fellow Israelites live among them. They must not lend money at interest or sell food at a profit. If a fellow Israelite becomes poor and sells themselves to another, they are not to be treated as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers and released in the Jubilee year, along with their children, so they can return to their own family and ancestral property. The Israelites are the Lord's servants, whom he brought out of Egypt, and must not be sold as slaves. They are not to rule over each other harshly, but must fear God. They may buy male and female slaves from the nations around them, or from the children of foreigners living among them. These slaves and their children will belong to them as property, and can be inherited by their children as permanent possessions. However, they must not rule harshly over their fellow Israelites. If an Israelite sells themselves to a foreigner living among them, they retain the right to be redeemed. One of their relatives can redeem them, or if they are able, they can redeem themselves. The price of their redemption is to be calculated based on the number of years until the Jubilee, as if they were a hired worker. If there are many years left, they must pay more. If there are few years, they pay less. They are to be treated as hired workers during this time, and the owner must not rule over them harshly. If they are not redeemed, they and their children are to be released in the Jubilee year. The Israelites are the Lord's servants, whom he brought out of Egypt. The Lord is their God. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, telling him to instruct the Israelites that they should not make idols or set up any carved images or stone pillars to bow down to. The Lord is their God. They must keep his Sabbaths and show reverence for his sanctuary, for he is the Lord. If they follow his statutes, keep his commandments and do them, he will provide rain in the right seasons, and the land will yield its produce, and the trees will bear fruit. Their harvest will be plentiful, lasting from the threshing time to the vintage, and from the vintage to the sowing time. They will eat their bread to the full and live safely in their land. The Lord will give them peace, so they can lie down without fear. He will remove harmful animals from the land, and no sword will pass through their territory. They will chase their enemies, who will fall before them by the sword. 5 of them will chase 100, and 100 will put 10,000 to flight. Their enemies will fall before them by the sword. The Lord will look upon them with favor, make them fruitful, increase their numbers, and establish his covenant with them. They will eat the old harvest, and the new will come in abundance. The Lord will set his dwelling among them, and will not reject them. He will walk among them, be their God, and they will be his people. He is the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt so that they would no longer be slaves. He broke the yoke of their oppression and enabled them to walk upright. However, if they do not listen to him or do not keep all his commandments, if they reject his statutes and abhor his judgments, breaking his covenant, he will bring terror, disease, and sorrow upon them. They will sow their seed in vain because their enemies will eat it. The Lord will set his face against them, and they will be defeated by their enemies, who will rule over them. They will flee even when no one is pursuing them. If they still do not listen, he will punish them 7 times more for their sins. He will break their pride and make their skies like iron and their land like bronze. Their strength will be spent in vain, as the land will not yield its produce and the trees will not bear fruit. If they continue to oppose him and refuse to listen, he will bring 7 times more plagues upon them according to their sins. He will send wild animals among them to take away their children, destroy their cattle, and make their roads deserted. If they do not accept his discipline and continue to walk in opposition to him, he will walk in opposition to them and punish them 7 times for their sins. He will bring a sword upon them to avenge the breaking of his covenant. When they gather in their cities, he will send pestilence among them, and they will be delivered into the hands of their enemies. When he breaks their supply of bread, 10 women will bake bread in one oven and ration it out by weight, but they will not be satisfied. If they still refuse to listen and walk in opposition to him, he will walk in opposition to them in fury. He will chastise them 7 times for their sins. They will eat the flesh of their sons and daughters. He will destroy their high places, cut down their idols, and cast their dead bodies on the remains of their idols, which he will abhor. He will lay waste to their cities and make their sanctuaries desolate. He will take no pleasure in the aroma of their offerings. The land will be so desolate that their enemies who live there will be appalled. He will scatter them among the nations and draw a sword against them. Their land will become desolate, and their cities will be ruined. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate while they are in the land of their enemies. The land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths, making up for the Sabbaths it did not enjoy while they lived in it. For those who survive, he will send fear into their hearts in the lands of their enemies. The sound of a wind-blown leaf will cause them to flee as though fleeing from the sword, and they will fall even when no one is pursuing them. They will stumble over each other as they flee, and they will have no strength to stand against their enemies. They will perish among the nations, and the land of their enemies will consume them. Those who are left will waste away in their iniquity in their enemies' lands, along with the iniquities of their ancestors. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness, and their opposition to him, if their hearts are humbled and they accept their punishment, then he will remember his covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, and he will remember the land. The land will be deserted by them and will enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. They will pay for their sins because they rejected his judgments and abhorred his statutes. Yet, even when they are in the land of their enemies, he will not reject them or abhor them to the point of destroying them and breaking his covenant with them. He is the Lord their God. For their sake, he will remember the covenant with their ancestors, whom he brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. These are the statutes, judgments, and laws that the Lord established between himself and the Israelites on Mount Sinai through Moses. The Lord also spoke to Moses, telling him to instruct the Israelites that when someone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord, the value of that person is to be set according to the following standards. For a male between 20 and 60 years old, the value is 50 shekels of silver. For a female, 30 shekels. For a male between 5 and 20 years old, the value is 20 shekels. For a female, 10 shekels. For a child between 1 month and 5 years old, the value is 5 shekels for a male and 3 shekels for a female. For a person 60 years old or older, the value is 15 shekels for a male and 10 shekels for a female. If the person making the vow is too poor to pay the specified amount, they are to be presented to the priest, who will determine the value according to what the person can afford. If the vow concerns an animal that can be offered as a sacrifice to the Lord, that animal becomes holy. The person making the vow must not exchange it or substitute a good animal for a bad one or vice versa. If they do substitute one animal for another, both the original animal and the substitute become holy. If the vow concerns an unclean animal that cannot be offered as a sacrifice, the animal must be presented to the priest, who will determine its value. If the person wishes to redeem the animal, they must add a fifth to its value. If someone dedicates their house as holy to the Lord, the priest will determine its value, whether good or bad, and the value will stand. If the person who dedicated the house wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth to its value, and it will be theirs. If someone dedicates part of their land to the Lord, the value will be determined according to the amount of seed required for it, 50 shekels of silver for every homer of barley seed. If they dedicate the land immediately after the Jubilee, the value remains as calculated. But if they dedicate it after the Jubilee, the priest will calculate the value according to the number of years remaining until the next Jubilee, and the value will be adjusted accordingly. If the person who dedicated the field wishes to redeem it, they must add a fifth to its value, and it will be theirs. If they do not redeem the field, or if they have sold it to someone else, it cannot be redeemed. When the field is released in the Jubilee, it will become holy to the Lord, like land devoted to him, and will become the property of the priests. If someone dedicates a field they have bought, which is not part of their ancestral land, the priest will determine its value up to the Jubilee year. The person must pay the determined value as something holy to the Lord. In the Jubilee year, the field will return to the original owner, the person from whom it was bought. All values are to be measured by the sanctuary shekel, which equals 20 gerahs. No one may dedicate the firstborn of an animal, because it already belongs to the Lord. Whether an ox or a sheep, it is the Lord's. If it is an unclean animal, it can be redeemed by paying its value plus a fifth. If it is not redeemed, it is to be sold at its value. However, anything that someone devotes to the Lord, whether a person, an animal, or land, cannot be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord. No one devoted to destruction may be redeemed. They must be put to death. All the tithe of the land, whether from the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to him. If someone wishes to redeem any of their tithe, they must add a fifth to it. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod, will be holy to the Lord. No one may pick out the good from the bad or make any substitutions. If they do, both the animal and its substitute become holy and cannot be redeemed. These are the commandments the Lord gave Moses for the Israelites on Mount Sinai.